The dust kicked up behind the old wagon as it rolled into Cedar Ridge that hot summer afternoon in 1885. People stopped what they were doing and stared. It wasn't unusual to see James Mitchell coming back from one of his trading trips to the Apache territories. What was unusual was what he brought back this time. 2 Apache women sat quietly in the back of his wagon. They wore traditional dresses made of soft deerskin, decorated with colorful beads and intricate patterns. Their long black hair was braided neatly down their backs. They looked around the town with calm, observant eyes, taking in everything but showing no emotion on their faces. James climbed down from the driver's seat, his weathered hands gripping the wooden side of the wagon. At 52, he was a man who had seen plenty of hard times. Deep lines marked his face from years of working under the Arizona sun. His wife Helen had died 3 winters ago from the fever, leaving him alone on his ranch with nothing but cattle and memories for company. The 2 women climbed down from the wagon with grace and dignity. The older one looked to be about 25, while her companion appeared younger, maybe 20 or so. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew exactly who they were. "Even in this strange new place, folks," James said, tipping his hat to the small crowd that had gathered. "I'd like you to meet Dawn and Star. They're sisters from the Chiricahua band, and they're my wives now." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, actually dropped the loaf of bread she was carrying. Young Tom Henderson's mouth fell open so wide a fly could have made itself at home. Even old Pete, who ran the general store and had seen just about everything in his 70 years, couldn't find words. Dawn, the elder sister, stepped forward slightly. She had kind but strong features with eyes that seemed to see everything. Star stayed close behind her, protective and alert. Both women carried themselves with a quiet pride that spoke of deep inner strength. "Now I know this might come as a surprise," James continued, his voice steady, despite the shocked faces around him. "But these ladies have agreed to make a new life with me. We had a proper ceremony with their tribe, and I aim to treat them with all the respect they deserve." The whispers started almost immediately. People began turning to each other, talking in low voices behind their hands. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others just stared in amazement. The Apache women stood there calmly through it all, as if they had expected exactly this reaction. Mrs. Patterson was the first to find her voice. "James Mitchell, have you lost your mind? What would poor Helen think if she could see you now?" James's jaw tightened at the mention of his first wife. Helen had been a good woman, kind and gentle, who had never said a harsh word about anyone. "Helen would want me to be happy," he said quietly, "and she'd want these ladies to be treated with kindness." But kindness wasn't what Dawn and Star saw in the faces around them. There was fear, disgust, and judgment. Some people looked at them like they were dangerous wild animals that might attack at any moment. Others stared like they were strange curiosities in a traveling show. The sisters had expected this. They had talked about it during the long journey from their homeland to this dusty frontier town. They knew they would not be welcomed with open arms. They knew people would judge them before even trying to know them. But they had made their choice for reasons that went deeper than what these strangers could understand. Their own people were facing impossible times. The government was forcing Apache bands onto reservations, taking away their freedom to live as they always had. Food was scarce and the old ways of life were disappearing. James had offered them not just marriage, but a chance at a different kind of life. A life where they could keep their dignity while adapting to a changing world. As the crowd began to break up, people walking away in small groups, still talking and pointing, James helped his new wives unload their few belongings from the wagon. They didn't have much. Some clothes, a few personal items, and small bundles that held sacred objects from their tribe. The Mitchell Ranch sat about 2 miles outside of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and well built. The main house was made of adobe and wood, with a wide front porch that provided shade from the harsh Arizona sun. There were corrals for the cattle, a barn for horses, and a well that provided clean, cool water. Dawn and Star looked around their new home with interest. They could see that James was a good rancher who took care of his property. The fences were mended, the buildings were in good repair, and the cattle looked healthy and well-fed. This was important to them. They respected hard work and knew that survival on the frontier required skill and dedication. That first evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, the 3 of them sat on the porch. James tried to make conversation, but there was an awkwardness that comes with any new arrangement between strangers. The sisters spoke mostly to each other in their native Apache language, their voices soft and melodic. James had learned some Apache words during his trading trips, but not enough for real conversation. Dawn and Star knew some English, but they chose their words carefully, speaking only when necessary. They were still figuring out this new world they had entered. In town, the gossip was already spreading like wildfire. At the saloon, men argued about whether James had the right to bring savages into their community. Some said it was his business and nobody else's. Others worried about what it might mean for the safety of their families. The women were even harsher in their judgment. At the church sewing circle the next day, the talk was all about the scandal at the Mitchell Ranch. Some ladies wondered if the Apache women would try to scalp people in their sleep. Others questioned whether the marriages were even legal or moral. "It's not natural," declared Mrs. Thompson, the banker's wife. "White men shouldn't be mixing with Indians. Nothing good can come of it." "Those women probably put some kind of spell on him," whispered Mrs. Garcia. "You know how these heathens practice witchcraft." But through it all, Dawn and Star continued their quiet observation of their new world. They watched and learned, understanding that they were strangers in a strange land who would have to prove themselves worthy of acceptance. They had survived worse challenges than the disapproval of a small frontier town. At the ranch, they began to establish their place in James's life and work. They proved themselves capable and hardworking, bringing skills and knowledge that would soon become invaluable. But that part of their story was still to unfold. For now, they were simply the Apache wives who had shocked Cedar Ridge with their very presence. The town had made its judgment, but time would tell a very different story about these remarkable women. The first time Dawn and Star walked into Cedar Ridge's general store, you could hear a pin drop. It was 3 days after their arrival, and James had asked them to come to town with him to pick up supplies. He figured it was better to get the introductions over with rather than letting people's imaginations run wild. Pete Anderson had run the general store for 15 years. He'd seen all kinds of folks come and go: cowboys, farmers, drifters, and even a few Apache traders. But he'd never had Apache women as customers, especially ones who were married to a local rancher. When James walked in with Dawn and Star following behind him, Pete's first instinct was to reach for the rifle he kept under the counter. Not because he thought they were dangerous, but because he wasn't sure how his other customers would react. Mrs. Patterson was there buying flour for her bakery. The moment she saw the Apache women, she grabbed her basket and hurried toward the door, bumping into shelves in her rush to leave. Her face had gone pale, like she'd seen ghosts instead of two quietly dressed women. "Morning, Pete," James said, acting as normal as could be. "Need to pick up some coffee and sugar. And the ladies here might want to look at some of that fabric you got in last week." Pete nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Dawn and Star. The two women stood close together, their faces calm and patient. They were used to being stared at by now, but it still wasn't comfortable. Star moved toward a display of colorful ribbons, her fingers gently touching the soft silk. For just a moment, her face lit up with the kind of joy any young woman might show when seeing something beautiful. But when she noticed how Pete was watching her every move, she quickly pulled her hand back and stepped away. "That's fine merchandise," Pete said awkwardly, trying to be polite. "Came all the way from back east." Dawn spoke for the first time. "How much?" Her English was careful but clear. Pete named a price that was double what he usually charged. James frowned but didn't say anything, not wanting to cause a scene on their first shopping trip. Dawn simply nodded and moved away from the ribbons. Word spread quickly through town about the visit to the general store. By evening, everyone had heard about how the Apache women had prowled around the merchandise and how Pete had to keep a careful eye on them. The story grew with each telling until some folks were saying the women had threatened Pete and tried to steal things. At the weekly town meeting held every Thursday night, the talk naturally turned to the situation at the Mitchell Ranch. Mayor Collins, a thin man with a carefully waxed mustache, tried to keep the discussion civil, but emotions ran high. "I'm not saying James doesn't have the right to live as he pleases," said Frank Wilson, who owned the largest farm in the area, "but we got to think about our families. What kind of example is this setting for our children?" "Exactly right," agreed Mrs. Thompson, the banker's wife. "My little ones ask me why those Indian women dress so strange and talk so funny. What am I supposed to tell them? Old-timer Johnson, who'd been in the territory since before most of the buildings were built, shook his head sadly. "I fought against the Apache for 10 years. Seen what they can do when they're riled up. Bringing them into town like this is just asking for trouble." But not everyone agreed. Dr. Williams, the town's physician, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Now hold on there. I've treated Apache patients before, and they're just people like the rest of us. Good people, most of them." "That's easy for you to say, Doc," replied Charlie Murphy, the saloon owner. "You don't have to worry about customers staying away from your business because they're afraid of running into savages." The word savages hung in the air like a bad smell. Even people who weren't particularly prejudiced winced at the harshness of it. But Charlie wasn't finished. "I heard tell that Apache women can put curses on people," he continued. "They got all kinds of heathen magic and such. Who knows what kind of trouble they might bring to our town." Mayor Collins rapped his gavel on the table. "Now let's not get carried away with wild stories. We're talking about two women who seem to be living peacefully with James Mitchell." "Peacefully for now," muttered Frank Wilson. "But what happens when they get tired of playing house? What happens when their warrior relatives come looking for them?" The fear in the room was real and growing. These were frontier people who had lived through Indian raids and government troubles. They had built their community through cooperation and shared hardship, but they also knew that survival sometimes meant being suspicious of outsiders. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Dawn and Star were establishing their own routines. They rose before sunrise, as was their custom, and began each day by giving thanks to the spirits of the land. They did this quietly, not wanting to upset James with practices he might not understand. They proved themselves to be excellent cooks, preparing meals that combined traditional Apache foods with ingredients available at the ranch. James was surprised by how flavorful their dishes were, seasoned with wild herbs and cooked in ways he'd never seen before. The sisters also showed remarkable skill with animals. They could calm nervous horses with gentle touches and soft words. They knew how to treat sick cattle using plant medicines they gathered from the surrounding desert. Dawn had a special gift for predicting weather changes by reading the sky and feeling the wind. But their skills meant nothing to the people of Cedar Ridge, who had already made up their minds. When the sisters rode into town for church services on Sunday morning, hoping to show respect for local customs, they were met with cold stares and whispered comments. The preacher, Reverend Hayes, was a kind man who welcomed everyone to his services. But even he seemed uncomfortable as he watched his congregation's reaction to the Apache women. Some families actually got up and moved to different pews, as if sitting too close might somehow contaminate them. During the hymn singing, Dawn and Star listened quietly to the unfamiliar songs. They had beautiful voices and could have added harmony to the music, but they sensed this wouldn't be welcome. Instead, they sat with hands folded, showing respect in their own way. After the service, the usual friendly conversations outside the church were strained and awkward. Families gathered in their usual groups, but there were frequent glances toward the Apache women who stood beside James's wagon, waiting patiently. Little Billy Henderson, only 6 years old, broke away from his mother and walked up to Star with the innocent curiosity of a child. "Why do you dress so different?" he asked. Before Star could answer, his mother rushed over and grabbed his hand. "Billy, get away from there!" she scolded, pulling him back toward their family group. The boy looked confused and hurt, not understanding why his natural friendliness was being discouraged. Star's face remained calm, but those watching closely might have seen a flicker of sadness in her eyes. Children were precious in Apache culture, and their innocence was to be protected and cherished. Being treated as someone dangerous to children was particularly painful. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. James tried to make conversation, but he could sense the mood of his wives. They had hoped that showing respect for local customs might help them gain acceptance, but it seemed their efforts had made no difference. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Dawn finally spoke about what they had experienced. "Your people are afraid of us," she said simply. James nodded, his face troubled. "Give them time. They'll come around once they get to know you." But Star shook her head. "Fear runs deep. It will take more than time to change their hearts." She was right, of course. The people of Cedar Ridge had built their lives around careful boundaries between us and them. Apache women living as equals in their community challenged those boundaries in ways that made many folks deeply uncomfortable. The sisters understood this better than James realized. They had faced prejudice before, though never quite like this. They knew that acceptance would have to be earned through actions, not words. But they also knew that some people might never be willing to see past their preconceptions. As the days turned into weeks, the pattern continued. Polite but cold treatment in stores, whispered conversations that stopped when they approached. Children pulled away from any contact. It was a lonely existence for two women who came from a culture that valued community and belonging. But Dawn and Star had inner strength that came from generations of survivors. They would wait and watch, learning the rhythms of their new community while staying true to themselves. Their time to speak would come, though none of them yet knew when or how. Dawn woke before sunrise as she had done every day of her life. In the quiet darkness of the ranch house, she could hear the gentle breathing of Star in the next room, and James's steady snoring from down the hall. These were the peaceful moments she treasured most when the world was still, and she could center herself for the day ahead. She stepped onto the front porch, her bare feet silent on the wooden boards. The desert air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. In her homeland, she would have greeted the sunrise with traditional prayers asking for guidance and strength. Here she did the same thing, but quietly, so as not to disturb her new family or draw attention from any passing neighbors. Star joined her a few minutes later, and together they watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. They spoke in soft Apache words, sharing thoughts about their dreams from the night before and their hopes for the day. These morning conversations were precious to them, one of the few times they could speak freely in their native tongue without feeling self-conscious. James found them there when he came out to start his morning chores. He still felt awkward interrupting what seemed like private moments, but the sisters always smiled and made room for him on the porch. They were trying to include him in their lives, even when language made it difficult. "Morning, ladies," he said, settling into his favorite chair. "Looks like it'll be another hot one." "Good for cattle," Dawn replied in her careful English. "They like warm sun on backs," James smiled. Over the past few weeks, he had come to appreciate how much the sisters actually observed and understood about ranch life. They had grown up in a culture where survival depended on reading the natural world with extraordinary precision, and those skills translated well to cattle ranching. After breakfast, the three of them would begin their daily work. James had been worried at first about how two Apache women would adapt to the routines of a cattle ranch, but his concerns had quickly proven groundless. Dawn and Star threw themselves into every task with energy and intelligence that amazed him. Dawn had a special gift with the horses. The ranch's most difficult stallion, a temperamental animal named Thunder that had kicked two previous ranch hands, became gentle as a lamb around her. She would approach him slowly, speaking in soft Apache words, her hands moving in gentle gestures that seemed to calm his wild spirit. How does she do that? James wondered aloud one morning as he watched Dawn easily halter Thunder for the first time in months. Star smiled. "My sister talks with animal spirits. They trust her because she listens to them." James wasn't sure what to make of that explanation, but he couldn't argue with the results. Under Dawn's care, all the horses became more manageable. They seemed healthier too, as if her presence somehow improved their well-being. Star proved equally valuable in different ways. She had an incredible memory for details and could spot problems that others missed. When one of the cows developed a slight limp that James hadn't noticed, Star pointed it out immediately. When a section of fence was beginning to weaken, she saw it days before it would have failed. "You have good eyes," James told her after she prevented what could have been a major problem with escaped cattle. "Apache women must see everything," Star replied simply. "Our people's life depends on noticing small changes." Both sisters demonstrated knowledge about weather patterns that went far beyond anything James had learned in his years of ranching. They could predict storms hours before clouds appeared on the horizon. They knew when the wind patterns meant a dry spell was coming and when underground water sources might be running low. "Storm coming tomorrow evening," Dawn announced one morning as she studied the sky. There wasn't a cloud to be seen, and James was skeptical. But sure enough, the next evening brought a fierce thunderstorm that would have caught him completely unprepared if he hadn't trusted Dawn's prediction and moved the cattle to higher ground. Their skills extended to practical crafts as well. Star could repair leather goods with stitching so fine and strong that the mended items were better than new. Dawn could weave rope from desert plants that was stronger than anything you could buy in town. They both knew dozens of uses for native plants that grew wild on the ranch property. One morning, James woke up feeling sick with fever and stomach pains. He was preparing to ride to town to see Dr. Williams when Dawn gently stopped him. "No need for town, doctor," she said. "We help you." James hesitated. He wasn't sure about Apache medicine, and part of him worried about what people in town might say if they heard he was being treated by savage remedies. But Star was already gathering plants from around the ranch, selecting leaves and roots with the precision of someone who had been trained from childhood. Dawn prepared a tea that smelled strange but not unpleasant. "Drink slow," Dawn instructed. "Fever will break soon." Within hours, James felt better than he had in days. The medicine had not only cured his immediate symptoms but left him feeling more energetic and clear-headed than usual. He never did figure out exactly what plants they had used, but he gained enormous respect for their healing knowledge. Despite their obvious skills and contributions to the ranch, the sisters remained largely silent when they went to town. They had learned that anything they said would be scrutinized and probably misunderstood. It was safer to speak only when necessary, and to let their actions speak for them. At the general store, they moved through their shopping with quiet efficiency. They knew exactly what they needed and where to find it. They handled merchandise carefully and always paid promptly, but their very competence seemed to make some people more suspicious, not less. "They're too calm," Mrs. Patterson complained to her neighbor. "It's not natural. They're planning something. Mark my words, I heard Indian women can be more dangerous than the men," whispered Mrs. Garcia. "They're sneaky and can't be trusted." The truth was that Dawn and Star were being careful because they understood how precarious their situation was. They were strangers in a strange land, dependent on the goodwill of people who had already decided not to like them. Every action was calculated to avoid giving anyone an excuse to cause trouble. They dressed modestly, combining elements of their traditional clothing with items that would seem more acceptable to townspeople. Dawn learned to braid her hair in styles that looked less foreign to local eyes. Star practiced walking with smaller steps and keeping her eyes downcast, even though this went against her natural confident bearing. At the church services they continued to attend, they sat quietly and followed along as best they could with unfamiliar rituals. They contributed coins to the collection, plate and listened respectfully to sermons that sometimes included references to heathen ways that needed to be corrected. Reverend Hayes had mixed feelings about their presence. He believed that all people were children of God and should be welcomed into the church, but he also worried about the comfort of his regular congregation, some of whom had threatened to find another church if the Apache women kept coming. After one particularly uncomfortable service where several families had walked out during the middle of his sermon, the Reverend decided to pay a visit to the Mitchell Ranch. He told himself he was making a pastoral call to welcome the new members of the community. But really he wanted to see for himself what kind of people these Apache women were. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and found the sisters working in a small garden they had started behind the main house. They had somehow coaxed vegetables to grow in soil that had defeated James's previous attempts at gardening. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "I'm Reverend Hayes from the community church." Both women stood and greeted him politely. Dawn invited him to sit in the shade of the porch, while Star went to fetch cool water from the well. The Reverend had come prepared to give a lecture about Christian values and proper behavior for church members. Instead, he found himself in a conversation with two intelligent, thoughtful women who asked sincere questions about religious teachings and shared insights that surprised him with their depth. "We want to understand your God," Dawn told him. "Our people know the Great Spirit in many ways. Perhaps your way is another path to same place." This wasn't the kind of response Reverend Hayes had expected. He had been prepared to deal with ignorant heathens who needed basic instruction, not thoughtful people who were seeking genuine spiritual understanding. By the time he left the ranch 2 hours later, his whole perspective had changed. He realized that his congregation's hostility was based on fear and prejudice, not on any real knowledge of who these women actually were. But changing one person's mind was easier than changing a whole community's attitude. The sisters continued to face cold shoulders and suspicious glances wherever they went. They adapted by becoming even more self-sufficient, relying less on town services and more on their own resourcefulness. They learned to grind their own corn, preserve their own meat, and make their own soap. They collected rainwater and grew herbs for medicine. They created a small world within the ranch where they could live according to their values while respecting James's way of life. The townspeople interpreted this self-sufficiency as proof that the Apache women didn't want to be part of the community. The first cold snap came in late October, 3 weeks earlier than anyone expected. Old-timers in Cedar Ridge had been predicting a mild winter based on the behavior of animals and the patterns of migrating birds, but they were wrong this time. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and a bitter wind began blowing from the north. Dawn woke before sunrise as always, but this morning felt different. She stepped onto the porch and immediately sensed something troubling in the air. The wind carried unfamiliar scents, and the sky had a strange yellowish color that reminded her of stories her grandmother used to tell about the worst winters in Apache. "Memory, sister," she called softly to Star, who was already awake and getting dressed. "Come feel this wind." Star joined her on the porch, and both women stood silent for several minutes, reading the signs in the air and sky. They had been trained from childhood to interpret the natural world with precision that could mean the difference between life and death for their people. "This will be hard winter," Star said finally. "Harder than these people expect?" Dawn nodded grimly. "We must prepare, and we must help them prepare, whether they want our help or not." When James came out for his morning coffee, he found his wives already busy with preparations that seemed almost frantic. They were checking and rechecking supplies, reinforcing shelter areas for the animals and gathering materials he didn't recognize. "What's got you ladies so worked up?" he asked, sipping his coffee and enjoying the crisp morning air. "It's just a little cold snap. Nothing we can't handle." Dawn looked at him with serious eyes. "This is not little cold snap. This is beginning of bad winter. Very bad winter." James was skeptical. He had lived in Arizona territory for 15 years and had survived plenty of cold weather. But over the past few months he had learned to trust his wives' understanding of natural signs, even when their predictions seemed unlikely. "How bad are we talking about?" he asked. "Bad enough that some people will not survive if they are not ready," Star replied. "We must make ranch ready for long, hard months." Throughout that day, the sisters worked with an urgency that was infectious. They moved livestock to more protected areas, reinforced the barn roof, and checked every fence line for weak spots that might fail under heavy snow or ice. They gathered armloads of firewood and organized food supplies with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. James found himself working harder than he had in months, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his wives might be overreacting. The weather was cold, but not impossibly so. The sky was gray, but not threatening. Everything looked like a normal autumn day to his eyes. By evening, however, the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees. Ice began forming on water troughs and puddles. The wind picked up strength and started howling around the corners of the buildings. "Tomorrow we go to town," Dawn announced as they finished a dinner of hearty stew and fresh bread. "People need to know what is coming," James frowned. "I don't think folks in town are going to appreciate unsolicited weather advice from outsiders." "People can die from pride," Star said quietly. "We cannot let that happen if we can prevent it." That night the temperature plummeted to levels that would have been unusual even in the depths of winter. By morning the water in the well had a thin layer of ice, and their breath made white clouds in the air even inside the house. James was no longer skeptical about his wife's weather predictions. If this was just the beginning, as they claimed, then Cedar Ridge was in for the kind of winter that could destroy unprepared families. The three of them rode to town that morning, bundled in coats and blankets. The horses' hooves rang on ground that was already beginning to freeze hard. Other people were hurrying about their business, looking surprised and unprepared for the sudden change in weather. At the general store, Pete Anderson was trying to keep warm by standing close to his pot-bellied stove. He looked up nervously when James entered with his Apache wives. "Morning, Pete," James said. "We're here to pick up some supplies, but the ladies have something they want to share with folks about this weather." Pete glanced uncertainly at Dawn and Star, who stood quietly near the door. "What kind of something?" Dawn stepped forward, choosing her words carefully. "This cold is not normal cold. It is beginning of hard winter. People must prepare for many weeks of ice and snow." "Now how would you know that?" Pete asked. his tone more curious than hostile. The bitter cold outside made him more willing to listen to anyone who might have useful information. "My people watch sky and wind and animals for many generations," Dawn replied. "These signs tell us winter will be long and dangerous." Other customers in the store had stopped their shopping to listen. Mrs. Patterson was there, along with 2 farmers from outside town and young Tom Henderson, who ran errands for his family's store. "What kind of signs?" asked Tom, genuinely interested. Star spoke for the first time. "Birds flying different pattern. Ground animals gathering food in panic, not slow preparation. Sky color wrong for normal weather change. Wind carrying scents from far north where big storms begin." The people in the store exchanged glances. These weren't the kinds of observations they were used to hearing, but they sounded specific and knowledgeable rather than like wild guessing. Pete cleared his throat. "So what are you saying we should do about it?" "Check food supplies," Dawn replied. "Make sure you have many weeks of flour, dried beans, preserved meat. Gather much firewood, more than you think you need. Prepare warm clothes and thick blankets. Check roofs and walls for places where cold air can enter. And do it quickly," Star added. "Storm coming in 3 days that will make travel dangerous. After that, you must stay in your homes for a long time." Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening with growing concern, finally spoke up. "How can you possibly know a storm is coming in 3 days? Even the almanac doesn't predict weather that precisely." Dawn looked at her patiently. "Apache people must know weather exactly, or we die. We learn from mothers and grandmothers who learned from their mothers and grandmothers. This knowledge keeps us alive for many generations." There was something in her tone and manner that impressed even Mrs. Patterson. This wasn't someone making wild claims or seeking attention. This was someone sharing life-saving knowledge that had been tested by generations of survival. Word spread quickly through town about the Apache women's weather predictions. Some people dismissed them as nonsense, but others remembered how accurately Dawn had predicted the thunderstorm weeks earlier. A few families began quietly preparing for a longer and harsher winter than they had planned. Dr. Williams was one who took the warning seriously. He made sure his medical supplies were well stocked and prepared his house for extended cold weather. Reverend Hayes also listened carefully and began checking on the most vulnerable members of his congregation, but not everyone was convinced. Frank Wilson, the largest farmer in the area, publicly scoffed at the predictions. "I've been farming this land for 12 years, he announced at the feed store. "I know what Arizona winters are like, and I'm not going to panic because a couple of Indian women want to play fortune teller." Charlie Murphy agreed. "These people are probably just trying to drum up business for their husband's ranch. Create a little panic, then offer to sell supplies at high prices." The skepticism hurt Dawn and Star more than they showed. They had shared their knowledge freely, without asking for anything in return. The idea that people thought they were trying to profit from fear was painful to women, who had been raised to believe that knowledge that could save lives should always be shared. But they continued their preparations anyway, and they encouraged James to stock up on extra supplies that they could share with neighbors if needed. They spent 2 days gathering herbs and plants that could be used for medicine during a long winter. They prepared food that could be stored for months and would provide nutrition when fresh food ran out. On the 3rd day, just as Star had predicted, the storm arrived. It began as a light snowfall in the early morning, but by noon it had turned into a blizzard that made travel impossible. The wind howled like a living thing and snow fell so thickly that you couldn't see 20 feet from the house. James stood at his window, watching the storm with amazement and growing concern. If this was what the beginning of winter looked like, he couldn't imagine what the worst parts would be like. "How long will this last?" he asked Dawn. "This storm, 2 days," she replied. "Then clear weather for maybe 1 week. Then another storm, bigger than this one." Star was preparing hot food and checking on the animals in the barn every few hours. Despite the terrible weather, none of their livestock seemed to be suffering. The sisters had positioned everything perfectly to provide maximum shelter and protection. In town, however, the situation was more difficult. Several families had run out of firewood by the 2nd day of the storm. Others were discovering that their houses were not as weatherproof as they had thought. Cold air poured through gaps around windows and doors that had seemed perfectly adequate in normal weather. The Henderson family was in particularly serious trouble. Their cabin was older and not well insulated, and they had not stocked enough fuel for an extended cold spell. By the morning of the 2nd day, They were huddled together under every blanket they owned. The Henderson cabin was still smoking when Dawn, Star, and James arrived in their wagon loaded with supplies. What remained of the small building was a black skeleton of burned timbers and collapsed walls. The family's few belongings were scattered in the snow, some saved and some destroyed by the fire that had swept through their home during the blizzard. Robert Henderson stood in the ruins with his wife Katie and their 4 children, all of them looking lost and overwhelmed. The youngest, little Lucy, was only 3 years old and kept asking why their house was all broken. Her breath made small white clouds in the bitter morning air. The fire had started when a piece of burning wood fell from their fireplace during the second night of the storm. With the fierce wind outside and the old, dry timber of the cabin, the flames had spread too quickly to stop. The family had barely escaped with their lives, grabbing what they could carry as they ran out into the freezing night. They had spent the rest of the storm huddled in Robert's small barn with the animals, sharing body heat with their milk cow and 2 goats. It had kept them from freezing to death, but just barely. Katie's hands were blue with cold, and the children were shivering uncontrollably despite being wrapped in every piece of clothing the family owned. Several neighbors had already arrived to help, but the situation was overwhelming. Mayor Collins was there, along with Pete Anderson and Dr. Williams. They were doing what they could, but resources were limited and the weather was still dangerously cold. "We can take the family in for a few days," offered Mrs. Garcia, "but we don't have room for all 6 of them long term." "Place is too small as well," said Pete. "Maybe we can split them up among several families, Katie." Henderson's eyes filled with tears at the thought of separating her children. The family had already lost their home and most of their possessions. The idea of being broken apart as well was almost too much to bear. That's when Dawn quietly stepped down from James's wagon. She had been observing the situation, taking in every detail with the careful attention her people paid to community crises. Without saying a word, she began unloading blankets from the wagon. Thick, warm blankets that Star had woven during their first months at the ranch. Star followed her sister's lead, carrying bundles of dried food and containers of herbal medicines. They worked with the efficient coordination of people who had dealt with disasters before, setting up what looked like the beginning of a temporary shelter. "What are you ladies doing?" asked Mayor Collins, not unkindly but with obvious curiosity. "Making warm place for family," Dawn replied simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The 2 sisters began arranging the blankets and supplies in a way that created a windproof shelter, using the remaining walls of the barn. They worked quickly and precisely, their movements showing skills that came from a lifetime of making the best of difficult situations. Robert Henderson watched them with amazement. "You don't need to do this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll figure something out." Star looked at him with gentle eyes. "Children are cold. Cold children must be made warm. This is not choice. This is what must be done." Within an hour, the sisters had transformed the drafty barn into a comfortable temporary home. They had created separate sleeping areas for parents and children, established a safe place for cooking, and even set up a small area where the children could play out of the wind. But they didn't stop there. Dawn disappeared for a while and returned with an armload of materials that most people wouldn't have recognized as useful. She began weaving together branches and strips of bark in a pattern that created incredibly effective insulation. "Where did you learn to do that?" asked Dr. Williams, impressed by the ingenuity of the construction. "Apache people must build warm shelter quickly," Dawn explained as she worked. "Sometimes have only few hours to make place that will keep family alive through cold season." Star was teaching Katie Henderson how to prepare warming teas from the herbs she had brought. The hot drinks not only warmed the children from the inside but also helped prevent the kind of illnesses that often followed exposure to extreme cold. "This will help little ones cough," Star said, handing a cup to young Lucy. "And this one will help mother sleep better tonight." Katie accepted the tea gratefully, but she was clearly struggling with accepting so much help from people she had previously avoided. "Why are you being so kind to us?" she asked quietly. Dawn paused in her work to look at Katie directly. "When child is cold, you warm child. When family has no home, you help build home. This is not kindness. This is what humans do for other humans." The simple truth of that statement hit everyone who heard it. Here were 2 women who had been treated as outcasts and potential threats, yet they were the first to offer practical, meaningful help when it was needed most. James had been unloading supplies from the wagon, but he found himself stopping frequently to watch his wives work. He had known they were capable and intelligent, but seeing them in action during a real crisis showed him depths of knowledge and skill he was still discovering. Other families began arriving throughout the day to help, and they couldn't help but notice how efficiently the Apache women had organized the relief effort. Instead of the chaos that usually followed disasters, there was a sense of calm purpose to everything Dawn and Star did. Young Tom Henderson, who was 8 years old, had been fascinated by the shelter construction. "How did you know how to make it so warm inside?" he asked Star. Star smiled at his curiosity. "My grandmother teach me and her grandmother teach her. Apache children learn many ways to survive in hard places. Could you teach me?" Tom asked eagerly. His mother started to intervene, worried about what people might think, but Star was already nodding. "Learning is always a good thing. Come, I show you how branches fit together." For the next hour, Tom worked alongside Star, learning techniques that no one else in Cedar Ridge knew. His natural intelligence and eagerness to learn reminded Star of her own childhood, when Apache elders would pass on survival skills to the next generation. As evening approached, the sisters prepared a meal that fed not just the Henderson family but everyone who had stayed to help. They cooked with ingredients from their own supplies, seasoning the food with herbs that made everything taste better than anyone expected. "This is delicious," said Dr. Williams as he accepted a bowl of stew. "What's the secret?" "No secret," Don replied. "Just plants that grow wild near ranch. Same plants your people walk past every day without seeing." The comment made several people think about how much they might be missing by not paying attention to the world around them. These Apache women seemed to see resources and possibilities that were invisible to everyone else. After the meal, as people prepared to return to their own homes, Mayor Collins pulled James aside. "Your wives have done something remarkable here today," he said quietly. "The Henderson family would have been in desperate straits without their help." "They're good people," James replied. "I've been trying to tell folks that for months." "Maybe some of us haven't been listening as well as we should have," the mayor admitted. But not everyone was ready to change their opinions. Frank Wilson had arrived late in the day and witnessed the Apache women's efficient organization of the relief effort. Instead of being impressed, he seemed suspicious. "Mighty convenient that they knew exactly what to do," he muttered to Charlie Murphy. "Almost like they've had practice at this kind of thing. Makes you wonder if they know more about how that fire started than they're letting on." Charlie nodded grimly. "Indian magic, maybe. They predict the storm. Then they're the first ones ready to help when disaster strikes. Seems awful suspicious to me." Their whispered conversation didn't go unnoticed by Star, whose hearing was exceptionally acute. She said nothing, but she understood that even acts of kindness could be twisted by people who were determined to think the worst. As the rescue effort wound down, Dawn and Star made sure the Henderson family was as comfortable as possible for the night. They left behind enough supplies to last several days and promised to return the next morning to continue helping with long-term solutions. "We can never repay you for this," Katie Henderson said, tears in her eyes. "No need for repay," Dawn replied. "Someday you help someone else who needs help. That is how kindness travels from person to person." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. James was proud of his wives, but also troubled by some of the reactions he had observed. "Some folks still don't trust your motives," he said finally. Star sighed softly. "Trust must be earned slowly over many seasons. Today was only beginning." "What if it's never enough?" James asked. "What if some people refuse to see past their prejudices no matter what you do?" Dawn was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Then we continue doing what is right anyway. Not because we expect thanks or acceptance, but because it is who we are." Back in town, the Henderson family settled into their temporary shelter with a sense of security they hadn't felt since the fire. The children fell asleep quickly, warm and safe under blankets that had been woven by hands they had previously been taught to fear. Robert Henderson lay awake for a while, thinking about the day's events. His family had been saved not by the people who looked like them or shared their background. 2 weeks after the Henderson fire, Cedar Ridge was facing a crisis that threatened the entire community. The second major storm had been even worse than Dawn had predicted, dumping 3 feet of snow and bringing temperatures so low that water froze solid within minutes of being exposed to air. When the storm finally passed, The townspeople discovered that their situation was desperate. The supply wagons that should have arrived from the territorial capital were weeks overdue, probably trapped by impassable roads. Several families had already run out of basic necessities like flour and coffee. Others were burning furniture to stay warm because their firewood was gone. Worst of all, the community's shared grain storage had developed a leak during the storm, and much of their reserve food supply was ruined. Mayor Collins called an emergency town meeting for Thursday evening, asking every family to send at least one representative to discuss their options. The meeting was held in the church, which was the largest building in town. As people filed in through the heavy wooden doors, their faces showed worry and fear. These were tough frontier folks who had survived many hardships, but this winter was testing them beyond their limits. James arrived with Dawn and Star, though they took seats in the back row as usual. The sisters had been attending town meetings for months now, always sitting quietly and never participating in discussions. Most people had grown used to their presence, though some still found it uncomfortable. Mayor Collins stood at the front of the church, his usually confident demeanor showing cracks of strain. "Friends, I won't sugarcoat our situation. We're facing the worst winter in memory, and our supplies are running dangerously low." He began reading from a list of problems that seemed to grow longer by the minute. The grain situation was worse than anyone had realized. Several families were already rationing their food to dangerous levels. The medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and Dr. Williams was worried about disease outbreaks that could devastate the community. "What about the supply wagons?" called out Mrs. Patterson. "Surely they'll get through soon." "The last message we received suggested it might be another month before travel becomes possible," the mayor replied grimly. "We can't count on outside help." Frank Wilson stood up, his face red with frustration. "So what are you saying? That we should just sit here and starve?" "I'm saying we need to come together as a community and figure out how to stretch what we have," Mayor Collins answered. "We need to pool our resources and make some hard decisions about rationing." The discussion that followed was heated and often desperate. People argued about how to distribute the remaining food fairly. Some families had been more prepared than others, and there was resentment about having to share with those who had been less careful. "Why should my children go hungry because the Henderson family didn't plan ahead?" demanded Mrs. Thompson. "That's not fair," Robert Henderson protested. "We lost everything in the fire. We would have been fine if not for that disaster." "Disasters happen," Frank Wilson shot back. "Smart people prepare for them." The arguing grew louder and more bitter. Neighbors who had lived peacefully side by side for years were suddenly turning on each other, under the pressure of survival. Mayor Collins tried to maintain order, but the fear in the room was stronger than his authority. Dr. Williams attempted to bring some reason to the discussion. "Fighting among ourselves won't solve anything. We need practical solutions, not blame." "Easy for you to say," Charlie Murphy replied angrily. "You've got medical supplies you can trade for food. What about those of us who don't have anything valuable to offer?" The meeting continued for over an hour, with the same arguments circling around and around. People proposed various rationing schemes, but each suggestion created new problems and new conflicts. Some families threatened to leave town rather than share their supplies. Others talked about taking what they needed by force if necessary. Through it all, Dawn and Star sat in perfect silence. They listened to every word, observing the dynamics of the group with the careful attention their culture had taught them to pay to community disputes. But they made no attempt to join the conversation. Finally, Mayor Collins called for quiet. "Look, we're not getting anywhere like this. We need to think more clearly about our options. Does anyone have suggestions that might actually work?" The silence that followed was heavy with desperation. People looked around at each other, but no one seemed to have any new ideas. The problems were real and the resources were limited, no matter how they tried to reorganize things. That's when Dawn quietly stood up from her seat in the back row. The entire room turned to look at her, surprise written on every face. In all the months she had been attending these meetings, she had never spoken a word. Most people had assumed she couldn't understand enough English to follow the discussions. "You may sit down," Frank Wilson said dismissively. "This meeting is for citizens who understand what we're dealing with." Dawn remained standing, her posture straight and dignified. "I understand very well what you are dealing with," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church. The quality of her English shocked everyone into silence. This wasn't the broken, careful speech they had expected from someone they assumed was barely educated. This was the voice of someone who had been listening, understanding, and thinking deeply about everything she heard. "You are arguing about division when you should be planning for multiplication," she continued, stepping forward slightly so everyone could see and hear her clearly. Mayor Collins found his voice first. "What do you mean by that?" Dawn looked around the room, making eye contact with people who had been avoiding her gaze for months. "You talk about sharing the food you have until it runs out, but you do not talk about finding new sources of food that exist all around you." "What new sources?" Dr. Williams asked, his scientific curiosity overcoming his surprise. Star rose to stand beside her sister, and when she spoke, her English was equally clear and educated. "The desert provides food in winter, but you must know where to look and how to prepare it safely." Mrs. Patterson shook her head in confusion. "There's nothing growing in this weather. Everything is frozen or dead." "That is what you think because you see only with eyes that know farming," Star replied gently. "But Apache people know hundreds of plants that provide nutrition even in hardest winters." Dawn moved to the center of the room, and people shifted in their seats to face her. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she commanded the complete attention of the entire community. "Under snow, there are roots that store energy through cold season," she explained. "Trees that look dead have inner bark that can be ground into flour. Certain cacti provide water and nutrients even when outside is frozen." "You're talking about eating weeds and cactus," Frank Wilson said skeptically. "That's not real food." "Real food is anything that keeps people alive and healthy," Dawn replied firmly. "My people have survived in this land for many generations eating what you call weeds. We know which plants are safe, which are dangerous, and how to prepare them so they taste good and provide strength." The room was completely quiet now. People were beginning to realize that they were hearing from someone with knowledge they had never considered might exist. Star continued the explanation. "There are also ways to make small amounts of grain stretch much further. Techniques for preserving meat that make it last longer. Methods for staying warm that use less fuel." "And you know all these things?" asked Reverend Hayes, his voice filled with wonder. "We know what our mothers taught us and what their mothers taught them," Dawn replied. "Knowledge passed down through many generations of surviving in hard places." Mayor Collins leaned forward in his chair. "Are you saying you could help us find enough food to get through the winter?" Dawn and Star exchanged a glance, communicating in the way that sisters do with just their eyes. "We are saying we could teach you to see resources where you now see only empty land," Star answered. "Why?" The question came from Robert Henderson, whose family had been saved by these same women weeks earlier. "Why would you help us when so many people have treated you badly?" Dawn's answer was simple and profound. "Because children are hungry. When children are hungry, nothing else matters except finding food for them." The silence that followed was different from the angry, frustrated quiet of earlier. This was the silence of people who were suddenly seeing their world through completely different eyes. Dr. Williams was the first to speak. "What would you need to teach us these techniques?" "Nothing but your willingness to learn," Dawn replied, "and your trust that we know what we are talking about." Frank Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "How do we know you're not just making this up? How do we know these wild plants won't poison us?" Star's response carried a note of steel beneath its gentleness. "Because we have been eating these foods our entire lives. Because our children have grown strong and healthy on this knowledge. Because our people would not have survived in this land for hundreds of years if we did not know what was safe and what was dangerous." Mayor Collins stood up slowly, his mind working through the implications of what he was hearing. "You're offering to share survival knowledge that could save our community?" The church had never been so quiet. Every person in Cedar Ridge seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to hear what the Apache women would say next. Dawn and Star stood at the front of the room now, no longer the silent observers they had been for so many months. "First, you must understand that winter is not enemy," Dawn began, her voice carrying the authority of generations of inherited wisdom. "Winter is teacher. It shows us what is truly necessary and what is just comfortable." She gestured toward the windows where snow could be seen falling gently in the lamplight. "Your people fight winter by trying to keep everything same as summer. Apache people work with winter, learning what it offers instead of only seeing what it takes away." Star moved to stand beside her sister, and together they began to paint a picture of survival that none of the townspeople had ever imagined. "Under this snow," Star explained, There are plants with roots full of starch and nutrients. Yampa roots, wild onions, Jerusalem artichokes that you call sunchokes. These plants store energy all summer to survive winter. They can feed your families if you know where to find them. But how do we find plants under 3 feet of snow? Asked Mrs. Garcia, leaning forward with genuine interest. Dawn smiled for the first time since standing up to speak. Plants leave signs above ground even in winter. Shape of dried stems, pattern of how snow settles around them, marks on bark of nearby trees. When you know how to read these signs, plants call out to you. The room erupted in quiet murmurs as people absorbed this idea. Tom Henderson raised his hand like he was in school. What about the trees? You said something about eating bark? Inner bark of certain trees very nutritious, Starr confirmed. Cottonwood, aspen, pine. Their inner bark can be dried and ground into flour. Mixed with other ingredients makes bread that will keep your strength up. Dr. Williams shook his head in amazement. I studied medicine for years, but no one ever taught me that trees could be food sources. White man's medicine very good for some things, Don acknowledged respectfully. But Apache medicine knows different things. Plants for healing, plants for nutrition, plants for warmth, all growing right outside your doors. What followed was the most extraordinary lesson in survival that any of them had ever received. The sisters took turns explaining techniques that had been refined over centuries of living in harsh environments. They described how to identify edible cacti and prepare them safely, removing the dangerous spines and bitter compounds. They explained which tree fungi were nutritious and which were deadly. They shared methods for finding water sources even when rivers and wells were frozen solid. Many small meals better than few large meals when food is scarce, Starr advised. Body uses small amounts more efficiently. Also, certain plants help body digest other foods better, make nutrients last longer in your system. What about staying warm? Asked Robert Henderson. We're going through firewood faster than we expected. Don's eyes lit up. This was knowledge that had kept her people alive through countless harsh winters. You build fires wrong for winter survival. Big fires that burn hot and fast waste fuel. Apache people build small fires that burn steady and long. She began describing fire-building techniques that focused on creating maximum heat with minimum fuel consumption. Methods for banking coals that could keep homes warm all night with just a handful of wood. Ways to redirect heat using stones and clay that multiplied the warming power of small fires. Also, you heat whole house when you only need to heat people, Starr added. Apache winter shelters designed to keep human bodies warm, not warm empty air. Much more efficient. Mayor Collins was taking notes as fast as he could write. These techniques, they really work? They work so well that Apache families survive winters in mountains where snow deeper than your houses, Don replied simply. The questions came faster now, as people began to grasp the scope of what they were learning. How do you preserve meat without salt? How do you keep vegetables fresh in freezing weather? How do you make clothing warmer without using more fabric? To every question, the sisters had practical, tested answers. They explained how to smoke meat using certain woods that both preserved it and added nutrients. They described root cellars that maintained perfect temperatures for food storage. They shared techniques for layering clothing that trapped body heat more effectively than thick coats. This is incredible, breathed Reverend Hayes. You're describing a completely different way of living through winter. Not different, Starr corrected gently. Just older. Your people forgot old ways when they moved to places where survival was easier. But knowledge is still there, waiting to be remembered. Frank Wilson had been listening with growing amazement, his earlier skepticism replaced by reluctant respect. Why didn't you share this information before? People have been struggling with cold and hunger for weeks. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dawn and Starr exchanged another of their meaningful glances before Dawn answered. Would you have listened? She asked quietly. 2 months ago, would anyone in this room have trusted Apache women to teach them about survival? The silence that followed was uncomfortable but honest. Every person in the church knew the answer to that question. We waited because wisdom shared too early falls on closed ears, Starr added. People must be ready to hear before they can truly listen. But children were suffering, protested Mrs. Patterson. How could you watch children go hungry when you knew how to help? Dawn's expression became stern, and for the first time her voice carried an edge of steel. Children were not suffering because we kept secrets. Children were suffering because adults were too proud to ask for help from people they considered beneath them. The truth of that statement hit the room like a physical blow. These women had been willing to help all along, but the community had made it clear that their help was not wanted. Dr. Williams cleared his throat. You're right, of course. We made assumptions about your knowledge and capabilities based on prejudice. But you're willing to help us now? Asked Mayor Collins hopefully. We are willing to teach anyone who truly wants to learn, Dawn confirmed. But this cannot be emergency lessons that you forget when spring comes. This must be real learning that becomes part of how your community lives, Star stepped forward. Also, you must understand that this knowledge comes with responsibilities. Plants that feed you must be harvested carefully, so they continue to grow for future years. Animals that provide must be treated with respect. Land that supports you must be cared for, not just used. You're talking about changing how we live, not just how we survive this winter, observed Reverend Hayes. Survival and living are same thing, Dawn replied. You cannot have one without the other. The conversation continued for another hour, with the sisters outlining a comprehensive approach to not just surviving the winter, but thriving in it. They described ways to turn the crisis into an opportunity for the community to become more self-sufficient and resilient. But perhaps most importantly, they revealed the depth of their education and intelligence. These were not the simple, primitive women that many townspeople had imagined. They were sophisticated thinkers who had been observing Cedar Ridge with keen insight for months. You understood everything that happened in our meetings all this time? Asked Mayor Collins with wonder. We understood your words and your actions, Star replied. We watched how you make decisions, how you treat problems, how you work together or fail to work together. We learned about your community the same way you should have been learning about ours, by paying attention. As the meeting finally began to wind down, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted in Cedar Ridge. The Apache women were no longer outsiders to be tolerated or feared. They had revealed themselves to be teachers with knowledge that could transform how the entire community survived and prospered. But Dawn wasn't finished. She had one more thing to share, something that would complete the transformation of how these people saw her and her sister. Tomorrow morning, we begin teaching, she announced. But tonight I want you to know why we chose to make our lives here with you. Despite how we were treated, she paused, looking around the room at faces that were now focused on her with complete attention. We came here not because we had no choice, but because we saw potential for something better, a place where Apache wisdom and white man's industry could work together. A community where children of all backgrounds could learn from each other and grow strong. Her voice became softer but more powerful. We stayed through months of coldness and suspicion because we believed that someday you would see us as we truly are. Tonight that someday has come. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People began to stand one by one until the entire church was on its feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. There were tears in many eyes, and not just from relief at finding solutions to their survival crisis. They were also tears of shame for prejudices finally abandoned, and tears of gratitude for patience and wisdom that had waited for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. The Apache women had spoken, and their words would change everything. Spring came to Cedar Ridge like a miracle, as the snow melted and revealed the desert landscape beneath. The townspeople could hardly believe they had survived what turned out to be the harshest winter in territorial history. More importantly, they had not just survived, they had thrived in ways they never thought possible. The transformation had begun the very morning after Dawn and Star's revelations at the emergency town meeting. Groups of families had gathered at the Mitchell Ranch before sunrise, eager to begin learning the survival techniques the Apache women had promised to teach. What followed were the most intensive and eye-opening weeks anyone in Cedar Ridge could remember. Dawn and Star proved to be patient but demanding teachers, sharing knowledge that went far beyond simple food gathering or fire building. They taught the townspeople to see the desert as Apache eyes saw it, not as empty wasteland, but as a complex ecosystem full of resources for those who knew how to look. Children learned alongside adults, their natural curiosity making them excellent students of plant identification and weather. Reading, young Tom Henderson became particularly skilled at finding the winter roots that had kept many families fed when their grain supplies ran low. Mrs. Garcia discovered she had a talent for preparing the tree bark flour that had supplemented their bread for months. Even Frank Wilson, who had been among the most skeptical, grudgingly admitted that the Apache fire-building methods had probably saved his family from freezing. But the sisters taught more than just survival techniques. They shared a completely different philosophy about living in harmony with the environment, rather than fighting against it. They demonstrated how cooperation and community planning could create abundance, even in the most challenging circumstances. Apache people think 7 generations ahead, Dawn explained during one of the outdoor lessons that had become daily events. Every decision we make, we ask how it will affect children not yet born. This is why our people survive when others do not. The winter had indeed been brutal, with storms that broke records and cold snaps that lasted for weeks. But by following Apache methods of food storage, heating, and community cooperation, Cedar Ridge had not only avoided disaster but actually strengthened its social bonds. Families that had been feuding over resource distribution found themselves working together on projects that benefited everyone. The shared learning experiences created new friendships across social and economic lines. Children from different backgrounds played together while their parents learned side by side. Dr. Williams had been particularly impressed by the Apache medicine techniques. Starr had taught him to identify and prepare dozens of local plants that could treat everything from coughs and fevers to digestive problems and skin conditions. "I feel like I'm discovering a whole new branch of medicine," he told James one afternoon. "These women have knowledge that could revolutionize how we think about healthcare in frontier communities." The changes weren't just practical, they were cultural. The weekly town meetings became collaborative problem-solving sessions rather than arguments between competing interests. People began consulting Dawn and Starr before making decisions that might affect the community's long-term welfare. Most remarkably, the sisters had accomplished all this while maintaining their own cultural identity. They continued to speak Apache to each other, to follow their traditional spiritual practices, and to dress in ways that honored their heritage. But they had also shown how their culture could enrich rather than threaten the existing community. By March, when the weather finally began to warm consistently, the town council made an unprecedented decision. They formally asked Dawn to accept a position as Cedar Ridge's first director of community resources, a newly created role that would involve planning for future emergencies and teaching sustainable living practices. The vote was unanimous. "I never thought I'd see the day when this town would elect an Indian woman to a leadership position," admitted Mayor Collins during the ceremony. "But then again, I never thought I'd see anyone transform our entire way of thinking the way you and your sister have done." Dawn accepted the position with the same dignity and grace she had shown throughout all the months of suspicion and hostility. "I accept not as Apache woman or white woman, but as member of community who wants all families to prosper." Starr was offered a similar position focusing on education and cultural exchange, which she also accepted. The school board asked her to develop programs that would teach children both traditional frontier skills and Apache knowledge of the natural world. The changes extended beyond official positions. The general store began stocking some of the native plants that the sisters had identified as useful for medicine and cooking. Pete Anderson learned to recognize quality wild foods and even started trading for them with Apache bands that passed through the area. The church services took on new dimensions as well. Reverend Hayes, deeply moved by the sisters' example of selfless service, began incorporating lessons about different paths to spiritual wisdom into his sermons. He spoke about how God's truth could be found in many traditions, not just one. "These women showed us that wisdom doesn't belong to any single people," he preached one Sunday morning. "It belongs to anyone humble enough to learn from others." The children of Cedar Ridge were perhaps the most transformed by the experience. They grew up learning that knowledge came in many forms, and that people who looked different or spoke different languages might have the most valuable lessons to teach. Little Lucy Henderson, now 4 years old, could identify edible plants as easily as she could recite her alphabet. Tom Henderson had become so skilled at Apache survival techniques that other children sought him out as a teacher. The barrier between us and them that had defined the adult world simply didn't exist for these youngsters. Most touching of all was the relationship that developed between the sisters and the families they had helped. The Hendersons rebuilt their home using construction techniques that combined traditional frontier building with Apache methods for insulation and weather resistance. The result was a house that stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer than anything else in town. We owe our lives to those women, Katie Henderson told anyone who would listen, not just because they saved us from the fire, but because they taught us how to really live in this place. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the community handled conflict and decision-making. The Apache tradition of seeking consensus through patient discussion had replaced the argumentative town meetings of the past. Problems were approached as challenges for the whole community to solve together, rather than battles between competing interests. When drought threatened the following summer, the community was ready. Using water conservation methods Dawn had taught them, combined with drought-resistant plants Star had helped them cultivate, Cedar Ridge weathered the dry spell better than any surrounding community. Travelers passing through began to comment on the unique character of the town. Here was a frontier settlement that seemed to have found a balance between progress and tradition, between individual needs and community welfare. "There's something different about this place," a territorial official observed during a visit in late 1886. "The people seem more, more thoughtful about how they live." Mayor Collins smiled with pride. "We learned from some very good teachers." Word of Cedar Ridge's transformation spread throughout the territory. Other communities began asking for advice on survival techniques and community organization. Dawn and Star found themselves traveling to neighboring towns, sharing their knowledge with people who welcomed them as respected experts rather than suspicious outsiders. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The women who had once been seen as threats to the community's way of life had become the architects of its success and reputation. James watched all these changes with deep satisfaction. The gamble he had taken in marrying the Apache sisters had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. His ranch had prospered under their management, but more importantly, his wives had found their place in a community that now valued their contributions. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch as they had done that first awkward night, the three of them would sometimes talk about the journey they had traveled together. "Did you know it would turn out like this?" James asked Dawn one evening as they watched the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors. Dawn smiled, the same patient smile she had worn through months of coldness and rejection. "Apache people learn to read signs in all things, weather, animals, plants. But people are hardest to read because they can choose to change. So you weren't sure our people would change?" "I was sure that children need to eat and families need shelter," she replied. "I was sure that when people are desperate enough, they stop caring about skin color and start caring about solutions. Everything else," she shrugged eloquently. Star joined the conversation from where she was tending her evening garden. "We hoped your people would see past fear to wisdom. But hope and certainty are different things. What made you so patient?" James persisted. "You endured months of treatment that would have driven most people away." The sisters exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Star answered.